There's only about 40 different antibiotic candidates in development, and this compares to hundreds in cancer.
Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines of knowledge as possible. I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I'm glad to be joined by Dr. Christine Aardal, Senior Researcher at the Norwegian Institute of Public Health. Dr. Aardal studies antimicrobial resistance, which is when the drugs we use to treat bacterial infections become ineffective. Today, she specifically explains how these drugs are developed and the economics of why antimicrobial research is underfunded. So thank you again so much for taking the time to join me today. I'm so excited to learn about this area because I think it's a huge issue for us to be focusing more on. And before we dive into the questions, I'd love to hear a little bit more about yourself and an introduction.
Well, thank you so much, firstly, for the invitation. So my name is Christine Aardal. I work for the Norwegian Institute of Public Health. You can probably hear I'm an American. I've been living in Norway. Norway has been my home now since the last 16 years. I started working in public health with my PhD. So I was interested in the topic of something called open source drug discovery. Basically interested in looking at alternative pharmaceutical innovation models for neglected diseases. So that work on my PhD really focused on more predominantly the diseases of low and middle income countries, things that you would think about like malaria, tuberculosis, and also, parasitical diseases like Schistosomiasis and things. And so I spent quite a bit of time working on these types of diseases. And I also came across that we also had a problem with antimicrobial resistance, and especially an innovation problem with antibiotics.
Regarding antimicrobial resistance, to begin with, what are some of the important uses of these compounds these days and why they become less effective over time?
So when we start talking about antimicrobials, it gets a bit confusing, right? Because not too many people know what a microbe is. So there's different kinds of microbes, which are very, very small organisms, things you can't see. You have to use a microscope to look at them. So there are viruses like COVID-19. COVID-19 is caused by a virus. A virus is a microbe. There are parasites, so things like malaria, that might be caused by a very tiny bug that you can become infected with. And then there's bacteria. So we have different types of medicines. So when you start talking about antimicrobial resistance, you're talking about looking at resistance across all those different types of microbes. And talking about resistance to malarial medicines is very different than talking about resistance to antibiotics. And they come from the same source, because basically what it means is the pathogen, which is the microbe that causes you harm. Most microbes don't cause people any harm at all. Most of the bacteria in your body do no harm. In fact, a lot of them benefit you, but there's some that do harm, and we call those pathogens. And so basically resistance means that they're no longer susceptible to being treated by whatever medicine we've developed. So for antibacterial resistance, that means antibiotics don't work anymore. So if you have a bacterial infection and you take an antibiotic, unfortunately, it doesn't work. You keep that antibiotic or that resistant infection, and you have to look for another antibiotic. And the reason why we see resistance, there's a lot of different reasons. Firstly, it's a part of natural selection. So the evolution is something that's always happening. And bacteria and parasites and viruses, they still evolve as well. So it's a natural selection process about changing and how they evolve. But there's some things that we can do to really stress them. And by taking excessive amounts of antibiotics is one of those things. Because if you think about it, if you take an antibiotic that kills a lot of different types of bacteria, which you've got a lot of different types of bacteria in your stomach and in your gut, then you'll kill a lot of different bacteria, even those that are good or really do no harm. And the only ones that are left behind to thrive are those that are resistant to that antibiotic. So basically, the more antibiotics we take, especially unnecessarily, because antibiotics only work against bacteria. And so we know that when we have a cold, that's caused by a virus, COVID-19, that's caused by a virus. We have, unfortunately, there is a tendency to take antibiotics when you have a viral infection. And that doesn't do anything except for to kill those bacteria within your system that really are doing no harm and leaving the resistant ones there to thrive. And the difference is that it's not necessarily just impacting the patient who's taking the antibiotic, because I can infect somebody else with a resistant bacteria by, coughing, sneezing. If you're not practicing washing your hands well enough, there's different ways to transfer these infections. So the fact if I take too many antibiotics unnecessarily, unfortunately, that could be transferred over to you who's never taken an antibiotic in your life. And that's the scary thing about antibiotic resistance and antimicrobial resistance.
Yeah, this sounds like a really big issue. How do we keep track of how much it already exists?
Antimicrobial resistance is a very multifaceted problem, because firstly, you have to know what kind of resistance is out there. What kind of resistance do you have in Canada or Norway or in wherever you're sitting? So you have to have good surveillance, not only about what kind of resistant organisms you're using are present in your country, but also about the types of antibiotics that you're using in your country, both for humans and for animals. But then you also have to look to see about what kind of availability you have for drugs. And that all of this combines with what innovation, if new drugs are actually coming to the market to serve those resistance patterns that you have in your country. And then, of course, there's always stewardship, because the more you use an antibiotic, the quicker that resistance develops to it. So it's a very multifaceted area, and there's a lot of experts across all of these different areas. So it's quite complex, but it's also very interesting.
I see. And now that we know what these drugs are and how important they are, I guess a good part to understand would be, how do we actually develop these drugs? What are some of the costs involved? What are some of the ways to make money?
So there's a pretty standard process for developing new medicines. And most of the ideas come within universities. So in our universities, we have academics and researchers. Perhaps they find a new molecule and think that it might have some beneficial aspects, and they apply to get grant financing. So somebody pays them to basically work on the discovery and the initial development of that potential new medicine. So that part generally happens in universities, and that's basically finding something that might be an applicable medicine and really working in laboratories to figure out how that medicine might be beneficial. And then once it gets developed up to a certain stage where we think that it actually might be useful to treat different diseases, then we have to go into what we call clinical trials. And clinical trials are when you start testing that medicine in humans. So people have to try it and see how it works. And there's 3 types of clinical trials. The first one is to make sure that it's safe. So they start out with a small group of people and to make sure that the medicine is safe. It's not going to hurt you in any way. And then the second phase that they do is they have to see, does it work? Is it what we call efficacious? And to do that, they also start with a small group of patients that have a specific problem, and they test that medicine against those patients. And then in the third phase 3 clinical trials, then we test it in a lot of patients. Because what you want to do is you want to try to find side effects that are uncommon, but to make sure that they're uncommon enough to justify that the medicine is important in treating whatever you are trying to treat. And when we get into clinical trials, these are very expensive because basically you have to work across multiple countries. We have to make sure that everything's done appropriately so that patients are getting the right medicine, to make sure that there's no unintended side effects. If those are detected, it needs to be stopped straight away. So really, medicine development begins to be very expensive once you get into the human trials. So that's important to remember. And generally what happens is the university will spin off a small company. So the academics that created the medicine will say, okay, we think that this medicine looks promising. So we'll create a small company for this medicine. And they'll start to do the first early phase clinical trials, the ones to make sure they're safe. And then likely a pharmaceutical company, a larger pharmaceutical company will come along and they'll say, okay, that's an interesting medicine that you have. And we think the results from your clinical trial are promising, and we'll purchase or license that product. And so generally it's the larger pharmaceutical companies that are coming in and paying for those clinical trials. And what they anticipate then is that the medicine will actually come to market. It's very risky. So most medicines will fail. They won't make it to market. But the company will say, we think that this looks like a promising medicine, bring it to market, and then they're awarded a monopoly time period. So they're protected from competition because they've put all this money into developing this new medicine. So for a period of time, there's no other company allowed to make this medicine. And therefore, they can charge a price which has to be within reasonable amounts in order for countries and patients to be able to afford using it. But that price that only they can sell that medicine, and that's how they recoup their investments, as also make their profits.
Yeah, I really appreciate you explaining that simply for such a complicated process. In terms of intuition, could you give a rough estimate of how much it actually costs dollar-wise?
It's a very tricky question because there's not a lot of great data. This is considered very confidential, very private data, and companies really don't want to come out and make this into public data. There's a couple of large studies that the pharmaceutical industry has let in to look at their accounting and their costs. And they estimate it costs more than $1 billion to develop a new medicine. But there's some caveats to this, because firstly, about half of that is the cost of what we call dry wells. And dry wells means that making medicines is really risky. So you're going to start pursuing different medicines that you think look promising, but end up being not effective. They don't work, or maybe they hurt the body. They're too toxic. And over 90% of the medicines that you start to perform research and development won't make it to the market. So when they fail, there's still a cost in that. And that's what we call dry wells, in the fact that you've dug all this way, but in the end, there's no water there. There's no rewards for that effort. So when we look at these amounts of over $1 billion, about half of that is dry wells. And about the other half of that is opportunity cost. So the cost that you could actually have been putting your money somewhere else to get a similar size reward. So if you do half and half, we're down to about $250 million in actual financial outlays. Now, that's a lot of money, That's definitely a lot of money, but it's a lot less than over $1 billion. But the numbers have been going up. And we don't have a lot of sources to compare this to.
And this is where it becomes so interesting to me to look at what are the ways that our economy is currently supporting this. I would love to highlight some of the research of yours that I was reading in particular here. One of the first things that I found interesting was, could you describe what health technology assessments do and like the role that they play in determining where the money goes?
Sure. So health technology assessments are a tool that some countries use to make sure that they're allocating taxpayer public health funding in a good way. Because we've got scarce funding, there's a lot of different things that we could be funding. So we want to make sure that for the population, we're getting the most of the health services out. So health technology assessment is something that's been developed to look at how much benefit the patient would receive. And it's applied to typically medicines. It's been expanded recently to other things, but mostly it's been used for medicines. And so when a new medicine comes onto the market, an assessment is done to say, what is the benefit for the patient? How many more years do we expect that this medicine can give to that patient? For example, if the patient has cancer, or how is this medicine going to improve the patient's life as far as, being able to make sure that people are mobile or can live at home, or there's a lot of different aspects to it. And the decision with health technology assessment helps to ensure that the public healthcare systems or private healthcare systems will reimburse that medicine. So if you're a pharmaceutical company and you bring a new medicine to market, you want the public healthcare system or the healthcare systems to reimburse and pay for that medicine. Because otherwise, obviously, most patients can't pay out of pocket the large costs of many of these new medicines. So it's vital that the healthcare systems reimburse for their medicines. And so this is something, it's a part of good governance. It's to make sure that we're not bringing on new medicines that are very expensive, that really don't have a patient benefit, and to make sure that we're prioritizing those that have the highest impact. Now, it gets a little bit gray when you come to antibiotics and other antimicrobials, because then, as we talked about before, it's not just the benefit for me, the patient, but it's the benefit for society. Because as the patient, I might benefit from taking a really strong antibiotic and it killing a large amount of bacteria in my body. So not only the one that's harmful, but the other ones, and that might make me better. But what that also does is it puts more pressure on to create those resistance bacteria, which can spread. And so when you start thinking about antimicrobials like antibiotics, then you need to start thinking about what is the societal value for these products. And that's something that health technology assessments don't do so well yet today. So right now, they're mostly looking at patient value, but fortunately, in the United Kingdom, they've actually started looking at societal value. So they've just started a pilot project where they're assessing 2 new antibiotics, and they're looking at 5 societal factors. They're looking at what is the value of this medicine stopping transmission, any infectious agent? What is the value of having this new antibiotic as an insurance mechanism in case some new bacterial threat comes? So in the United Kingdom, they're performing health technology assessment with this societal value, which will be coming out at the beginning of next year. And this is really the first country to try this out. So this will be great to see what they come out with and really give a whole set of learnings to those countries that are performing health technology assessments today.
Yeah, wow. I can't even imagine the complexity of trying to measure something like that. So good thing that we have educated professionals working on that. And to reiterate, this is important because at the end of the pipeline, the revenue for the pharmaceutical companies, that's what determines what they do all throughout and which drugs they decide to fund.
That's right. Exactly. So, because in also in many countries, the outcome of the health technology assessment will determine the price of the medicine. So not only the reimbursement, but also how much is reimbursed. So that it's really critical to pharmaceutical companies, of course.
Yeah. And then I guess working our way backwards through the economic cycle here, it sounded like when you were saying that the initial stage is funded by grants, I'm sure public health agencies do a lot of that funding. Is that where taxpayer dollars are going usually?
Yes. So most of the early stage research is either publicly or philanthropically financed. So if we look at antibiotics, for example, the very early stage, identifying a molecule that may be useful as a medicine, that would be likely financed by a national research organization. And once it gets a little bit beyond that, there are multilateral organizations that finance. So, for example, there's an organization called CarbX, which finances all the way up to the phase 1 clinical trial. And they're financed by the US government, by the philanthropic organization Wellcome Trust in the UK, the German government, and they've got about 5 different financing organizations. So there's opportunities to basically be financed up to clinical development. And within antibiotics, there's also new financing availability for the later stage clinical trials as well. The newest one is through actually the pharmaceutical industry. So about 30 companies have come together to invest in antibiotics. They've put, I believe it's $1 billion into a fund and will invest and expect to receive a return on their investment, which would be good if they did. So there is some financing as well available for the late stage, but there's much less and it's much more costly.
This is the part of the discussion where we'll start exploring alternative models, and what would be good is to set a expectation, I guess, of how well the system is working and what are some examples of it not working.
So for antibiotics, it's really important to separate antibiotics from antivirals from antimalarials because there's different barriers for each of these different groups. So I'm just going to focus on antibiotics now. For antibiotics, the process that we just described is not working well. And the reason why is because when you take an antibiotic, it cures you. Hopefully, that's the intended result. So you take a course of antibiotics for a week or so, and it cures the infection, and then you don't need to take it anymore. So basically, the cost of that week of medicines has to give that reimbursement that the pharmaceutical industry is looking for. And that means quite high prices. Luckily, in high-income countries, multi-drug resistant antibiotic resistance is fairly rare. So for example, I'm sitting in Norway, and in Norway, we have very low antibiotic resistance rates. The antibiotic that we use most here in Norway was developed in 1943, and we're still using it, but we still want to have access to new antibiotics because on the occasion, there will be multi-drug resistant antibacterial infections that we will want, of course, to cure that patient. But it's not a very promising revenue model to develop these very expensive new drugs for, a handful of patients in Norway, maybe a couple thousand across Europe, a couple thousand in North America. Now, Norway is a bit of an exception because we do have very low resistance. In Canada, there's also quite low antibiotic resistance. The US may have a bit higher. We also know that there is higher antibiotic resistance in middle-income countries. And in low-income countries, even though they may not have access to the newest antibiotics, there is also high levels of antibiotic resistance. And that has to do with poor drinking water and sanitation systems. And it shouldn't matter where you are in the world. If you have an infection, you should be able to find an antibiotic that will treat that infection. So there's a lot of complexity to the issue. But the fact that in high-income countries, that companies aren't able to find profitable to develop new antibiotics and have them be profitable is a huge problem. So now in clinical development, in the phase 1, 2, 3 human clinical trials that we talked about earlier, there's only about 40 different antibiotic candidates in development. And this compares to hundreds in cancer. So cancer is generally seen as a more profitable business model for the pharmaceutical industry, whereas antibiotics is a loss-making proposition. So we were really not seeing the innovation that we need. And the entire time, bacteria continue to evolve as, they will. And there'll be new types of resistance coming out. So we will need new antibiotics. The other problem with this is that if you want to make a brand new antibiotic that nobody's used before, and so that's really the kind that we want, the antibiotic that no bacteria has ever been exposed to. So there's no resistance out there. It's really costly and it's really risky to develop. And so when we look at these 40-some antibiotics that are now in human clinical trials, they're basically improvements or slight changes to older antibiotics. So that means when they come to market, they'll probably have some resistance out there already. And that's really not what we need. We need these really new, exciting products that we hope nobody uses because we want to put them on the shelf and save them for that terrible day when we need them. But we really do want them quite badly. And so that's why the business model doesn't work, because you can't reward pharmaceutical industry based on not selling anything. And so what some countries have been doing, like the UK has started with their pilot, is what they want to do is to pay a subscription model, kind of like Netflix. So they're going to perform their health technology assessment and find out what is the value of they're looking at 2 antibiotics. So for each of these antibiotics, what's the value for the United Kingdom, including all of those societal values that we talked about. And then they're going to pay that amount per year to keep access to those antibiotics. And then they can use as much or as little, but we know it'll be as little because the UK is also focusing very much on holding resistance down and stewarding those antibiotics. And this is a way that gives predictable revenues to industry so that they know they're being rewarded for the societal value as well as the patient value, and they're getting a predictable reward, annual reward for access, not for consumption. And that's where we're starting. So the UK is really only the first to have come so far. Sweden has also implemented a similar model, but the Swedish model focuses mainly on ensuring access. So they haven't focused on stimulating innovation yet.
So it sounds like the issue here is that for most pharmaceutical drugs, we currently pay for their consumption, but for antibiotic and antimicrobial compounds, there's value that we should be paying for in just holding on to these drugs.
That's right. That's exactly right.
That sounds very scary, actually. You're saying we have 40 weapons, but millions of species to fight with these 40 weapons.
But we have 40 possible weapons. 3 to 5 will make it to market.
And that's quite scary.
It is scary. I mean, we still have our existing arsenal of antibiotics, though, the antibiotics that we've been using since the Second World War. these antibiotics are not useless. Resistance develops, absolutely. Luckily, most of these antibiotics are still effective in treating a wide variety of infections, but not all of them. And that's the scary bit.
Yeah, clearly it's really important for our entire species to be working together on this. And I just can't get the feeling out of my head that maybe the government should be doing a little bit more, because oftentimes what economists call public goods, so things like roadways, education, energy grids, all of these things get funded by the government because they bring a lot of value to a lot of people. And to me, it seems like antimicrobial drugs also bring a lot of value to a lot of people. Is there a reason that the government doesn't directly pay for roads and antimicrobials the same way?
Well, you're spot on in talking about public goods, because a lot of people talk about antibiotics as public goods. And governments are paying for them in the fact that they are funding the research. And if you have a publicly funded healthcare system, they're oftentimes covered in the healthcare system. The question is about the development of new antibiotics. And we've seen actually a huge resurgence in investment in research for antibiotics in the last 5 years. So this organization that I mentioned, CARB-X, that was created about 5 years ago. We also have other organizations, one that's a partnership with the WHO called GARD-P, and they're also a new organization created in the last 5 years. And what they do is they work with companies to also bring important new antibiotics to market. And when they come to market, then they take the license for the low and middle income countries, which is great. And so they're ensuring the accessibility of those antibiotics in those markets, which is fantastic. So I would say that the public sector, they are recognizing that there's a need for continuous antibiotic innovation, and they are taking steps, but it takes a little bit of time. It's not a very popular idea to be subsidizing the pharmaceutical industry. Unfortunately, the pharmaceutical industry isn't in the highest regard with citizens. And so the idea of giving big payouts to large pharmaceutical companies, it takes some time to think about how to do that in an effective manner. But there's actually, it has been moving. So I would say that it's not a failure. We're just, taking our time to put things in place. So the UK and Sweden have moved the swiftest. The US has a bill in Congress right now called the Pasteur Act that could also put in place a subscription type model for the US. In Europe, we're looking at also putting in place a model, and there's recently been a process to start the design of that model. And the pharmaceutical industry and antibiotic developers will tell you it's going much too slowly. And maybe that's true, because most of the innovators now for antibiotics are small companies, and they're very vulnerable. And if they don't receive financing, and if there's no opportunity once their antibiotic comes to market to have some sort of profitable business model, then they go bankrupt. And so we've had 3 small companies go bankrupt in the last couple of years that have antibiotics on the market. It's a bit of a tricky time period right now, but there is progress being made.
Yeah, that's amazing to hear. If you were to guess at the future directions that still need attention, where do you think are some areas currently being neglected that maybe more researchers, policymakers, whoever will be focusing on?
Well, right now, because of the investments that have been made in the last 5 years, the preclinical pipeline, so before human trials, is stronger than it's ever been for antibiotics, probably since the last 50 years. So that's great. But these products are going to need financing to get through the human clinical trials. So that's the first step, to make sure that the important antibiotics we're going to need within the next 5 years actually are financed to bring them to market. And then we have to start implementing these pull incentives in more countries than the UK and Sweden. So we need to make sure that Europe implements a pull incentive, and that the US hopefully will pass their pull incentive and implement that, and other countries as well. There is a willingness. Countries have expressed interest in implementing new economic models. So they know about the problem, and there's a willingness to do something. And now they're looking for the concrete solutions to do that. So I think really doing the implementation, that's going to be the biggest challenge within the next couple of years.
And sorry, the pull incentive is that subscription model you were talking about?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's what we call them pull incentives, because basically that means that there's some big reward sitting once the antibiotic has reached the market that's pulling them to the market.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And finally, to go sci-fi for a second, are there any super weapons or new types of technologies that we can look forward to in the future?
Yeah, so there's a lot of also very exciting therapies that aren't traditional antibiotics, that aren't traditional molecules. So bacteriophages are a type of virus that will attack specific bacteria. And there's antivirulence therapies, there's monoclonal antibodies like we've seen in COVID-19. There's a lot of exciting innovation coming down the pipeline. So all of this as well has to be digested, because we don't necessarily have clear regulatory pathways for some of these technologies, because they're not like a traditional medicine where you'd have a large clinical trial. The bacteriophage may be created for one patient, and therefore you can't really have a clinical trial for that process. There's also, with bacteriophages, how do you decide how to create the bacteriophage, and how do you deliver it to the patient, and all of these processes that have to be in place. And I'm no clinician, so I'm a business person, so I might be getting some of this wrong, but it's quite complicated. And there's also some global equity issues, because with these new technologies as well, we could come to a place where we have antibiotics, older antibiotics that basically treat most of the infections, but we're able to treat the multi-drug resistant infections with these new therapies like bacteriophages or antibodies or something else. But the question is, are those going to be accessible in low and middle income countries? And will the public healthcare systems or the healthcare systems in these countries be able to receive them and treat the patients effectively? So if all high income countries start really looking for these new technologies to be the answer to multi-drug resistance, we need to really think about access in a global access mechanism.
Yeah, that geography issue is quite concerning, because it's not like the decisions made in, say, a lower income country do not affect the people living across the ocean.
Yeah. Unfortunately, well, right now with COVID-19, we don't see a lot of global equity, do we? With the vaccines, and only 3 or 4% of people in low-income countries have been offered the vaccine, which is terrible. This is something that I think we're going to continue to struggle with, not to be too pessimistic, but really with antibiotics, we need to make sure global access is key. The good thing about antibiotics and bacterial infections are that they're not like COVID-19. They do not come as quickly, and they do not spread as quickly. So we have, of course, had pandemics in the world caused by bacteria, but due to our arsenal of antibiotics right now, at least the clinicians that I've spoken with and the microbiologists don't see that the pandemic potential for a very quickly spreading resistant bacteria. So that gives some time to really work on these options, where we did not have that with COVID-19.
Yeah, I admire your optimism, and I think it's good that we wrap up. giving, this mix of here is the progress we're making, and also here are the issues that we still are grappling with. And I hope that more people start to pay attention to this and start to work on this, because the actions of one person do influence the entire world here. So yeah, I really appreciated you going from the sixth grader basics to the current state of where we are and where we need to be.
Well, it's been my absolute pleasure. So thank you so much, Madhav. It's been great to talk with you.